All right, everyone. We are just going to wait a few more minutes to make sure everybody is able to log on, and then we will begin our presentation. If you all want to start getting comfortable with the chat function, feel free to put in your name and what state you are from. All right. Well, so hello again, everyone. Welcome to NCSL's webinar, Optimizing Child Welfare Financing Through Legislative Action. My name is Gerard Brown, and I'm a policy analyst with NCSL's Children and Families Program, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. We encourage participation through our chat box. So feel free to type your questions and answer any questions in the chat box, which is in the lower left hand of your screen. Once again, to begin building some comfortability with the chat function and also to learn who is on the line today, I invite you to type in your state, the state from which you're calling now. So child welfare financing is often treated as a complex and difficult to understand topic. And I'm not going to lie to you, it can be. After all, as one wise woman once put it, if you've seen one child welfare system, then you've seen one child welfare system. But our hope today is that our experts can help you all to better understand the topic and leave here with some ideas about how your child welfare system can best utilize federal, state, and local funding streams. With that in mind, first, we'll hear from Christina Rosinski and Sarah Catherine Williams at Child Trends about the results from their latest child welfare financing survey. Then we'll hear from Kelly Crane at Prevent Child Abuse America about some exciting child welfare opportunities made available through the American Rescue Plan Act. Before hearing from legislators about what's going on in their states. And lastly, we'll open up the floor to your questions. Before we begin, I wanted to remind you all that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the link. And with that, I will turn things over to Christina and Sarah Catherine.
Great, thank you so much, Gerard. And hi, everyone. I'm Christina Rosinski from Child Trends, joined by my colleague, Sarah Catherine Williams. And we are pulling up the slides, there we go, about our latest child welfare financing survey. So first, just to give you a brief overview of what this survey is, we conduct this survey here at Child Trends with support from the Annie E. Casey Foundation and Casey Family Programs. This latest survey covers state fiscal year 2018 and represents the 11th iteration of the survey since 1996, meaning that it's done every other year in even years. And the goal of the survey is to document the sources and amounts of spending by child welfare agencies across the country. And this data that we collect through the survey allows for documentation of national, but also state-specific trends. And it also allows people to compare between states. In this latest survey, as you can see here, 51 states participated, and that includes DC and Puerto Rico. For simplicity, we call them states as well. So 51 states participated. The only state that was unable to respond this round was Idaho. And as we go through and provide some of the findings that we'll share with you today, it's important to keep in mind that the survey captures expenditures on child welfare activities. This does not include unspent, allocated, or appropriated dollars. These are actual expenditures for child welfare programs and services and activities. And one thing I'll note here that we'll come back to later is that our state fiscal year 2018 products include a conversation around relevant context about 3 key issues from 2020. And this is because the 2018 report was just released, and so it's important for us to make a connection to the latest topics being discussed. And so, of course, COVID-19, also the renewed and necessary attention to race equity, and the Family First Act. So we make connections to those three contextual issues throughout our products, and we'll come back to that later in the presentation. And so before we go into the details and provide some of the findings, Sarah Catherine is going to provide us with some important background information about child welfare financing. So Sarah Catherine, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. And to start us off, I believe we have a polling question. So I think, Gerard, or do you queue those up? Here we go. All right. So the first polling question, thank you, is the majority of child welfare agency expenditures is financed by federal sources, state and local sources, or other sources. So we're curious just to kind of take a temperature of the folks on the call to see what you guys think. This is not a test by any means, but we are curious, kind of folks' initial impressions of which are the majority of, where do the majority of expenditures come from? All right, so it looks like most everyone, or we have a majority of folks who think that the majority of child welfare agency expenditures are financed by federal sources. And we are going to find out the answer to that question. So I will move us on to the next slide. So child welfare agencies are charged with protecting and promoting the child welfare of children and youth who are at risk of or who have been victims of maltreatment. And most child welfare agencies use a combination of federal, state, and local and other funding sources. And these sources include multiple federal funding streams, each with its own purpose and requirements. So we have all of these listed out here on this slide, but to give you a brief overview of each one of these funding sources, Title IV-E of the Social Security Act can be used for foster care, adoption, guardianship, supports for transition age youth, and this is the largest federal funding stream for child welfare. And then Title IV-B of the Social Security Act can be used for a variety of child welfare services, including prevention of maltreatment, family preservation, family reunification, services for foster and adopted children, and training for child welfare professionals. Medicaid, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, covers health-related services for millions of low-income individuals. The Medicaid dollars reported on our survey are only the Medicaid dollars that are claimed by child welfare agencies, not the state's overall Medicaid spending on the child welfare population. So that's an important distinction to make. These are Medicaid dollars claimed by child welfare agencies. Then we have temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, which can be used to support a variety of child welfare activities, in addition to being a source of cash assistance for low-income families. The Social Services Block Grant is a flexible funding source of federal funds that child welfare agencies can use to promote self-sufficiency, prevent or remedy child maltreatment, reduce inappropriate use of institutional care, and more. And then there are some other smaller federal funding streams as well. But only 2 of the federal funding streams listed here are dedicated to child welfare purposes specifically, and that's Title IV-E and Title IV-B of the Social Security Act. The other sources are non-dedicated, meaning that they can be used for other non-child welfare purposes as well. So later on, when we refer to dedicated or non-dedicated funding streams, that's what we're referring to, dedicated to child welfare or non-dedicated. And then there are some other funds that are used by child welfare agencies as well, in addition to these state and local funds and federal funds, such as third-party income sources or third-party in-kind contributions or private dollars. And this slide here shows you that state and local funds actually make up most of the child welfare agency expenditures. So, I think that's something new that some folks have learned today. They make up a little more than half of child welfare agency expenditures, and then federal funds make up the most of the rest of child welfare agency expenditures. And so this figure here shows you in all of the expenditures on child welfare services, kind of the breakdown of each individual source. So you can see within federal funds, Title IV-E makes up the largest proportion, followed by TANF, SSBG, Medicaid, 4B, and other federal funds. And just a little more context here is we just wanted to make sure to show you how much child welfare agencies spend relative to other national priorities. This slide here shows that child welfare agency expenditures in state fiscal year 2018 were $33 billion. And this includes spending from all of the sources that I just talked about, the federal and state and local and other sources. And on the right here, you can see how much the federal government spent in federal fiscal year 2018, which is $4.1 trillion. And this is, we by no means think that this is a perfect comparison. It is not, but it just kind of helps put into context how much is spent on child welfare compared to like overall federal expenditures. So with this background information in mind, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about some key findings from our 2018 report, but I believe we also have another polling question. So I'm going to kick it back to Christina.
Great, thank you. So question number 2. Over the past decade, do you think child welfare agency expenditures have increased, decreased, or stayed the same? Give folks a moment to respond. All right, can we see the results?
It looks like you might have stumped some people with this one. We haven't gotten very many votes quite yet. Here it is. They're coming in now. Okay.
Okay. Take your best guess. All right, so we have about half of folks saying increased, about a quarter of folks saying decreased, and 20% stayed the same. All right, so let's see what the answer is. So on the next slide, we'll present a summary of key findings. We're going to go through each of these at a high level right now, and then we'll dive into each one more specifically. But the first one answers that polling question. So total child welfare agency expenditures have increased by 6% from state fiscal year 2016 to 2018, and increased 2% over the past decade. So those who said increased, gold star for you for today. Key finding number 2 that we'll go through is that child welfare agency expenditure trends and financing sources vary greatly among states. Also, a variety of factors provide context for the trends in child welfare financing over the past decade. Key finding number 4 is that, as in our prior surveys, we found that child welfare agencies use nearly half of all of their funds, all of their spending on the costs of out-of-home placements, with smaller proportions spent on other child welfare services. And then the final key finding that we'll go through today is that less child welfare agency prevention spending is focused on substance abuse and mental health services than on other preventive services. So diving right into key finding number 1. As Sarah Catherine mentioned before, child welfare agencies reported spending $33 billion in federal, state, and local funds on child welfare services in 2018. And this 33 billion, again, represents a 6% increase since the last time we did this survey in 2016. And I should note here that whenever we talk about comparisons across states, increase 6%, increase 2%, these are all dollars that have been adjusted for inflation. So they are apples to apples comparisons and not related to the changing value of the dollar over time. And then in terms of the trend over the decade, it is a less dramatic, just a 2% increase over the decade, as you can see in this line graph here. Another thing to note, to flag, is that in this line graph, it is only representative of 32 states that were able to provide data in every year listed in this graph. That's so that it's, again, an apples to apples comparison and not just fluctuating because a state could or could not respond in a given year. And so that explains why in 2018, line graph says 20 billion, but the orange circle says 33 billion. It's just that the line graph is a more comparable analysis. And so with that, I will hand it back to Sarah Catherine to walk us through key finding number 2.
Key finding number 2 is that states vary greatly in terms of child welfare agency expenditures, which I'm sure is not a surprise. It's important to recognize that national findings mask extensive state variation in all aspects of child welfare financing, including how expenditures have changed over time, the percentage of expenditures sourced from federal and state and local funds, and even, the mix of federal sources used and how those dollars were spent. And I love that quote that Gerard gave at the beginning, that if you've seen one child welfare system, you've seen one child welfare system. And the same is true for their funding, their funding profiles and structures. So this slide here shows how expenditure trends vary among states. Despite an overall 6% increase in child welfare spending between 2016 and 2018, states varied widely in the magnitude and direction of the changes in their spending. So the figure on this slide shows the states experiencing the largest percentage changes percentage changes in total expenditures between 2016 and 2018. And as you can see in this box here, there were more states that reported an increase than reported a decrease. And additionally, the sources that child welfare agencies use to fund services also varies greatly among states. The slide here shows the breakdown of total expenditures by federal and state and local sources for just a handful of states. New Hampshire had the largest proportion of funding coming from federal sources and the smallest coming from state and local sources, with the opposite being true for Delaware. They used a larger proportion of state and local funds than any other state. And we can only fit a few states on this slide, but we do have a breakdown of this graph for every state that responded to our survey in the main report, which we'll show you a link to later. But if you're interested in learning more about your specific state, you can take a look at our main report. We have another polling question real quickly. This is almost a little bit of a check your understanding polling question. So the third question is, child welfare agencies in every state use federal funding sources in similar ways. Is that true or is that false? Give you guys a minute to think about that one. All right, so the vast majority of you guys said that this is a false statement, that agencies use and every state use federal funding sources in similar ways. Good job, guys. They use them in very different ways, which we are going to talk more about on this slide. The image or graph that you see here breaks down the previous slide a little bit more by showing how the federal proportion of that chart is broken down. A few years ago, we did some work examining each state's funding composition and identified 4 types of funding profiles. And, the first one that you see here, we have one example of each one of these profiles. The first one is a balanced funding structure in which the Child Welfare Agency uses a mix of federal and state and local funds and draws on a diversified selection of federal funding sources, so both dedicated and non-dedicated. Then we have a federal dedicated funding structure in which the Child Welfare Agency uses more federal than state and local funds and draws primarily from dedicated federal funding streams like Title IV-E and Title IV-B. I wish those didn't rhyme, but Title IV-E and IV-B. Then we have a federal non-dedicated funding structure where agencies use more federal than state and local funds again, but they rely more heavily on non-dedicated funding streams like Medicaid, TANF, SSBG, and others. And again, those non-dedicated sources are those that can be used by other agencies or other purposes besides child welfare. And then finally, we have a state and local funding structure where the agency relies primarily on state and local funds instead of federal sources. And again, here we've shown you one example of each funding profile for 2018, and you can find the profiles for all states in one of the appendices of our report. And the variation across states, we have our hypotheses as to, we do, these aren't all hypotheses, but we know these are some reasons why states vary in how they fund their child welfare services. And you can see those listed here. The first, the ability to meet match requirements. Some of the funding streams that we've talked about are open-ended entitlement programs that require states to provide matching funds, while others are block grants that do not require a match. And while most states want to maximize the use of open-ended entitlement funds to access as much federal support as possible, states have to have sufficient funds to meet match requirements. For example, Title IV-E's 50% match requirement for administrative costs. And the availability of state and local dollars, therefore, can limit the use of some federal funding sources. So for instance, if a state has limited state and local funds, it may prefer to rely more heavily on federal funding streams that do not require it to contribute a state require it to just contribute state or local matching funds. So like SSBG would be a good example of one of those sources. The next factor would be the characteristics of children served by the Child Welfare Agency. That can affect which funding streams are used due to eligibility criteria associated with some of those funding sources. For instance, if a state has few children that are eligible for Title IV-E or for Medicaid, the Child Welfare Agency is going to be limited in its Title IV-E and Medicaid expenditures, just by the sheer fact that there aren't as many children that meet those qualifications or that eligibility criteria. And then there's also competition from other agencies for the non-dedicated funding streams like TANF, which means that some child welfare agencies may find it difficult to access those sources. And that competition can be particularly great in times of economic downturns, when pressures on, for example, TANF cash assistance are higher and they leave fewer dollars available for other purposes. And then finally, the federal funding stream requirements, such as eligibility determinations, can place a high administrative burden on states, which can be costly, and sometimes, quite frankly, it'll outweigh the benefit of receiving the funding to begin with. And this could cause some states to rely more heavily on state and local funds. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to Christina.
Great. So in thinking back to that first key finding where we talked about child welfare agency expenditures increasing over the past decade, you may be wondering at this point, what is behind that? What is contributing to these trends over time? And so, of course, going off of what Sarah Catherine just presented, this is going to vary by state, and it's very complex. A lot of different factors go into this, but there are a few big picture explanations that we can offer. So first is changes to the population being served. So looking over the past decade, between 2008 and 2018, we saw that the number of children in care has decreased by approximately 6%. Even though there was an increase in the middle of that decade, kind of overall, the number of children in care has gone down. And so you may be thinking, okay, well, that's a decrease, and that appears to conflict with the finding that total child welfare agency expenditures have increased over that same period. But we know there's more to the story here than just the number of children in care. For example, we know that the number of children who were referred for maltreatment went up over the decade. And so that could support an understanding an increase in child welfare agency spending, given the costs of responding to maltreatment reports. Also, we know that the number of children receiving adoption and guardianship assistance, that affects costs. The number of substantiated cases of maltreatment affects costs, as well as just the needs of the population over time may change and have higher or lower needs over time, and that can also affect spending year to year. Another important factor to consider when looking at trends is cuts to programs that fund child welfare agencies in recent years. And so, as you know, sequestration stipulated automatic spending cuts starting in federal fiscal year 2013 if Congress was unable to reduce spending. And so most of the child welfare funding streams that we were talking about before were not affected by sequestration. Two sources, Title 4B and the Social Services Block Grant, they were affected. So they experienced some cuts due to sequestration. In addition, Title 4B appropriations have remained relatively flat over the past decade, meaning that after you account for inflation, the funding levels have lost value over time, year after year. But as you saw earlier, Title 4B and SSBG are pretty small federal funding streams, kind of in the grand scheme of things. Then Title 4E, which was the biggest federal funding stream for child welfare agencies. And we saw over the decade, Title 4E expenditures have gone up. And so that, even though some child welfare funding sources have gone down, like 4B and Social Services Block Grant, 4E is so big that the increases in 4E have outweighed the decreases seen in some of the other funding streams. And one of those other funding streams that experienced the decrease over the decade was Medicaid. So again, this is just Medicaid spending by child welfare agencies, not by a health department, for example, just by child welfare agencies. And when comparing state fiscal years 2008 and 2018, we found that fewer states reported that the child welfare agency accessed Medicaid dollars over time. That being said, it appears that total Medicaid spending on the child welfare population and overall, regardless of agency, has remained stable. It's just that the Medicaid spending by child welfare agencies is going down. And then finally, there have been recent changes to Title 4E. Again, this is the largest federal funding stream. And like I mentioned before, Title 4E expenditures went up over the past decade. They actually increased by 11%. And this is because, primarily because of the ongoing impact of the Fostering Connections Act of 2008. And that legislation allowed more children and youth to be eligible for adoption assistance under 4E. And so with more children eligible, it increased the expenditures. Fostering Connections also gave states the option to operate a Title 4E guardianship assistance program. Sometimes this is referred to as GAP or KingGAP. In addition, the Fostering Connections Act allowed states to claim additional training costs starting in 2009 And it also allowed Title IV funds to be used to cover the costs of youth over 18, so between 18 and 21, who remain in foster care after their 18th birthday. So all of those policy changes due to the Fostering Connections Act help explain these increases in Title IV-E. You may be thinking at this point, what about Family First? Another major legislative change to Title IV-E. We haven't seen the impacts of Family First just yet because this survey just covers state fiscal year 2018. But with the next survey that we're developing now, that will cover state fiscal year 2020. And that's when we'll start seeing some of the early impacts of Family First. So we have another polling question, gearing us up for the next key finding, and it is, what do you think child welfare agencies spend most of their dollars on? Adoption and guardianship, child protective services, out-of-home placements, preventive services, or services and assistance for older youth? And we actually mentioned this a little earlier, so this is also seeing how closely folks are paying attention. But again, it's all in good fun, no test. All right, great. Folks are paying attention. 73% said out-of-home placements. You are absolutely right. And you can see this on the next slide, which is key finding number 4. And this is where we get into how child welfare agencies are using their funds, not just how much they're spending or where the money is coming from, but what are they doing with the money? And so as you can see here, about half of all child welfare agency expenditures involved out-of-home placements, with much smaller percentages spent on other services. So you can see here, adoption and guardianship, CPS, prevention services, all of those are in the 15–19% range. And then services and assistance for older youth just makes up about 2% of total child welfare agency expenditures. And while this graph just shows total spending, federal, state, and local all combined, but when we break out federal versus state and local, the story is the same. There's not a big difference between how states are using federal versus state and local dollars. And then finally, key finding number 5 focuses on prevention. And so we asked states to report the kinds of prevention services child welfare agencies paid for. And as you can see here, fewer child welfare agencies focus prevention funding on substance abuse and mental health services than on other kinds of preventive services. And you can see the top prevention services are parent skill-based programs and caseworker visits and administration. And so while, one thing to keep in mind interpreting this is that, while child welfare agencies may not be the ones focusing on substance abuse and mental health, it's likely that child welfare agencies are partnering with other agencies in the state, like a health department, for example, that fund substance abuse and mental health. And one thing to keep an eye on going forward, again, this is 2018 data, but given that the Family First Act now allows states to seek Title IV-E reimbursement for substance abuse and mental health prevention programs, we're going to keep an eye on whether this slide and the data on this slide changes over time, and whether child welfare agencies do start spending a greater proportion of their prevention dollars on substance abuse and mental health. So those were our key findings. I'm just going to go through really quickly just a brief overview of the kinds of resources that we have available for your use. You can see here on this slide just a few of the products that we have. We have a main report that goes through in a lot more detail what each funding stream is, what the trends are over time, much more detail about how child welfare agencies are spending their dollars. We have pages upon pages of appendices with state level information that you can sort through. We also have funding source specific fact sheets. So for each of the funding streams we talked about, we have a short, like 5-ish page resource that provides information just about that funding stream. Likewise, we have a fact sheet for every state. So, you can go in and just look for your state and find your state's fact sheet that provides all the data that were provided by your state. And then we also have a spreadsheet with state by state data. And just quickly, just a sampling to get you excited about these resources. These resources allow you to examine change over time as well. So in the state fact sheets, you'll be able to see how much was reported in the latest year and how that is different from prior years. You can also see on the next slide breakdowns in certain programs, certain funding streams, and how that has changed over time. So there's a lot of detailed information that's available on our website that you can look through. And so there's another resource that Sarah Catherine has been involved in producing. So I will hand it back over to her so she can share that resource as well.
Great. So one of the things we wanted to make sure to do today was try and, help equip you guys with information or data that could be useful to you. So in addition to the resources that Christina just highlighted, we also have state level data on a variety of child welfare topics that, it might be useful to you in your work. These state level fact sheets can help you get a better understanding of the child welfare population in a particular state or in your state. And, again, this is just another tool that you can use, in your efforts to try and improve services for children, youth, and families. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions about these resources, or if you're looking for additional information or have questions about anything that you see in our reports. So that is the end of our part of the presentation. So we are going to kick it back to Gerard.
Yes. Thank you both for that wonderful presentation. Now I'll turn things over to Kelly Crane with Prevent Child Abuse America.
Unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Christina and Sarah Catherine. That is a lot to unpack and so helpful. Now I get to make it even more confusing and talk about some of the funding streams within child welfare, and even that kind of along the prevention continuum as well. And I'm going to share my screen. A second. There we go. All right, so good afternoon. Like Gerard said, my name is Kelly Crane, and I'm with Prevent Child Abuse America, and I'm going to do my best to share information on how some of the recent federal legislation, including the American Rescue Plan Act, can play a role in shaping the future of child welfare financing, and particularly around how a state's many decisions that they need to make can really determine what services are available to meet the needs of children and families in their state. So first, just a little bit on who Prevent Child Abuse America is and what it is that we do. We are the nation's oldest organization dedicated to preventing child abuse and neglect before it occurs. And this is our mission and vision statement. We have 4 strategic pillars within our organization at Prevent Child Abuse America. Healthy Families America is our signature home visiting model. And home visiting is a prevention strategy that's used to support pregnant and parenting and new parents as they work through the challenges of being a parent and raising young babies. And then we have a policy arm, which is where I sit, where we support state level work as well as work with members of Congress and kind of committees of jurisdiction at the federal level as well around different legislation. We also are involved in public engagement and impact efforts in a number of avenues, but most notably is our pinwheels. You might have seen them around your state capitol during April, which is Child Abuse Prevention Month. And then we also have a nationwide network of Prevent Child Abuse chapters that each do amazing things by providing services, advocating, supporting children and families in different ways. And so lastly, we also do evaluation and research. We have fundraising efforts and have different engagement and strategic partnerships at the national and state level. So that's a little bit about who Prevent Child Abuse America is. So there are, like Sarah Catherine and Christina mentioned, a lot of federal, state, also local funding streams that support children and families. And most recently, there are some new opportunities and new fundings for states through the impact of the pandemic, the American Rescue Relief Plan, as a response to the pandemic. So this is some of the federal funding streams that Sarah Catherine and Christina actually shared in their slides, but I just wanted to pull up some of these, all the same ones that were mentioned, but a few more are on here that are more related to the prevention end of the spectrum. So many state funding sources draw down federal funds and then are distributed throughout state agencies. And all of these federal options support a range of programs and services for families and children. And how states utilize these funds, as was just shown, varies among states. So yeah, this is just a number of the federal funding streams. And I included the community-based child abuse prevention grants, Title II, and then the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, which is Title I. So I just wanted to draw those attention because I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. So the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act includes direct support for children and families with the goal of helping states address the many challenges facing children and families today, especially impacted through the pandemic. And there's a tremendous amount of funding in this American Rescue Relief Plan that will help families throughout the child welfare continuum, from primary prevention efforts to youth exiting foster care. So some of them are included here, but there was included in the plan was child care block grants and also child care stabilization funding, which will support both child care providers and families to help pay for child care. There was $150 million obligated for the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program, emergency funds. That was there to ensure families that are pregnant or recently had children can have the resources they need to promote healthy child development. And then the community-based child abuse prevention, Title II emergency funds, that falls under a lot of acronyms, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, is another just a significant amount of money that's the funding is going to go directly to communities to provide community-driven supports for families to strengthen families so that children can remain safely at home. And there's also a lot more that was included in the act, expanding the child tax credit, money to help education and other vital public services running. Direct payments to families, just for them, WCAP is the acronym, which is Title II under CAPTA. So it says that my internet is unstable. I hope you guys can see me. It froze. Hope I'm better. Apologies, the demands of working from home. So I just want to dig into this kind of the CBCAP emergency funding that's part of the American Rescue Plan. And this is a significant amount of funding that's divided among all 50 states for community-based services to create environments where families get the support they need, including such things as parent support programs, home visiting programs, family resource centers, and coordination amongst kind of mental health and substance use and domestic violence services. And this $250 million, this one-time emergency funding, is a historic investment in this prevention funds, and it actually represents a 400% increase from the last allotment. It again provides grants to all 50 states to meet the needs of communities throughout public-private partnerships. And funds are available through September 30th of 2023 to be spent by 2025. And HHS, the Health and Human Services, has already begun distributing these funds. This, I just want to share this slide as well. This is just to show this investment in prevention. It's a CBCAP represents the main federal investment in prevention, and there's been a steady increase in these funds since FY19. However, in FY 2021, there still is a great deal of unmet need. And so this shows that between FY19 and FY 2021, there was a significant increase, but in this 2021 pandemic relief bill out of the American Rescue Plan was a significant investment. Okay. And just to share some of the allowable uses that are under CBCAP arm of the funding, it's a pretty wide-ranging funding that provides critical supports to families. So this just lists some of those kind of critical supports of what that could look like, on the ground. It could include providing vital supports to families, including evidence-based home visiting program, community-based parent support programs, amongst other things. And this also is a lot of this funding is braided with other collaborative efforts through early childhood or TANF or McVie funding that was talked about before as well. So some state examples, these CBCAP emergency allotments for states ranged from 175,000 for some of the territories up to 29 million in California. They received, I think, 29.7 million, are going to receive $29.7 million in this funds. And the funds are submitted to the states and the territories under a formula grant. They were allotted proportionally among the states based on the number of children under the age of 18 that reside in each state. The other good thing with this emergency funding is that it waives the match, the state match. Previously under CBCAP funds, or normally there's a 20% match in non-federal funds. This emergency funding waives that state match. So the funds are distributed to CBCAP state leads. They are agencies that are designated by the governor to administer and oversee the CBCAP program. And they received notice of this funding allotment back in April. And then they had to submit plans for what the spending would look like by June 7th. So all the state plans by the CBCAP state leads had been submitted. The guidance was really kind of wide reaching and let states really have a lot of discretion for how they plan to spend the money. And so this is just a little bit of what I've heard on some of the states. So as an example, Ohio, they were allocated almost $9 million in this emergency funding. And some of the planned uses that they have in place are to develop a child abuse and neglect prevention awareness campaign to reach hundreds and thousands of families, provide concrete supports to families. Around 75,000 Ohio initiatives in the state, such as safe sleep campaigns, infant mortality, child sex abuse prevention, and legal representation as a prevention strategy. Virginia is another example, received over $6 million in their allotted CBCAP emergency funding. And the state is planning to hold a legislative special session in August to really look at the state budget and then how to think about spending these funds, as well as all kind of the money in the American Rescue Plan. Some more examples. Kentucky, they were allotted over $3 million in the CBCAP funding, and the state has pulled together what they're calling a statewide prevention collaborative to really assess kind of the needs of children in the state, needs of families in the state, and then grantees, which will be applying for the funds, are hoping to use it in a bunch of different ways, but some include an outreach campaigns on prevention, similar to what Ohio's thinking. Warm lines, which is different than a hotline, the child abuse hotline. Warm lines are 1-800 numbers that states have in place to call for issues, kind of neglect issues, or your own, if you need help on different services, things like that. They hope to expand parent education support in the state and expand kind of father engagement as well. And Delaware was allotted $700,000 in their funding. And they also are convening what they're calling a task force in the state to review what the current prevention services look like in the state and identify the gaps and the needs where the application of funds will really go a long ways. And they're also using the prevention strategies as described by the Centers of Disease Control, those that are most critical to preventing child maltreatment as they have those discussions in their state. There's a lot more examples, I'm sure, but just wanted to kind of raise some of them of how states are looking and thinking about using this kind of emergency funding. And I also wanted to touch on the money that was appropriated in the American Rescue Plan for MCV, which is the Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visiting Program. Also a significant investment in that. This money is going to fund the 56 current MCV program recipients. There will be 400 million actually allotted out of that 150 million to those states. That was also through a formula approach, kind of based on need funding. So they based this distribution of funds based on the number of COVID-19 cases in the state and the number of children living in poverty in each state, as well as a base funding, which was distributed based on each recipient's proportion of their FY20 MCV formula grant. What else? Just significant, there'll be another round of ARP awards that is planned for FY2022 to continue to support kind of the home visiting need in states as well. Oops. And then lastly, I know that both Sarah Catherine and Christina touched a little bit on the Family First Prevention Act, and I just wanted to raise this, even though this is not part of the ARP, but I wanted just to raise this federal funding opportunity that's recent right now, the Family First Prevention Services Act. And this is really the legislative foundation for states to reorient their child welfare systems around prevention and family. And this legislation alters the federal financing structure for child welfare program, which is known as the Title IV-E, by providing services to families at risk of entering foster care to hopefully prevent the removal of a child or teen from their home. So pre-Family First, this was implemented in 2018, pre-Family First, actually since 1980, Title IV-E could be used by child welfare agencies for services and supports only after the child has been removed from the home. But now with Family First, the focus is on family and not exclusively the child either. It can give states additional resources to promote
Uh-oh, it looks like you froze there, Kelly. I think we'll give it a couple minutes to catch back up, and if you could kind of
flexibility
start at the
with
beginning.
Sorry. Let me know when you see me, Gerard. You see me now?
I think you're back.
All right. I hope I wasn't making a silly face for you all, or maybe that was good entertainment. Let me know if it happens again, Gerard. Sorry. I'll just jump kind of a sentence back just to just talk about how this legislation is really altering the financing structure for child welfare, allowing them to use funds for upfront services and prevent a child from coming into care. So implementation in Family First began in 2020 for their, Family First Prevention Plan services. States have an option to delay until fiscal year 2022, which means that they have the option to opt in to Family First Prevention Plan by September 30th of 2021. So as of, so there are many states that have submitted their prevention plan to opt into this funding. Right now there's 100% match. There's no state match, I guess I should say, no state match to receive this funding to be reimbursed for these prevention services, should they choose to submit a prevention plan. And as of today, the states I know of, there's been 24 states that have submitted a prevention plan, with 12 of them having an approved plan. That number is probably not 100% accurate, as that's just kind of my, prevention plans don't have to be made public. And so this is kind of what I've learned through my Google searches and asking around and through connecting with states to see where they're at in their prevention plan process. But around 24 states have submitted a plan and are in the process, and 12 of them are in the process of kind of getting that reimbursement right now. So it's a good opportunity for states to really kind of reorient the system to the front end of prevention services and get reimbursed for those services. So what's next? I just kind of shared a lot of information about those different funding streams, but wanted to just share how as was shared by previously by Sarah, Catherine, and Christina, that federal grants provide a large share of state and local revenue. Funding for states are around just over 30% as of 2017. Federal grants made up about 30% of state budgets. So it just underscores the significant role that federal dollars play in financing state government and play in kind of the programs that are in states. So this state and local funds cross all levels of prevention and child welfare, but are primarily tipped more towards secondary or tertiary prevention when a family is already at risk. And so with the CB-CAP funds, hopefully that the scale can tip a little bit the other way. And states are really working on increasing the community programs for families, building up family resource centers for families to go to when they're in need, warm lines. There's also been a lot of talk around alternative pathways to child protective services. What kind of services can parents and families at risk receive to avoid entering foster care? Expanding voluntary home visiting services, and then through the implementation of their Family First prevention services plans, we'll see where states fall in kind of preventing children from coming into the foster care system. There's also some news around President Biden's FY22 budget that was released. There's some money in that proposed budget for competitive grants for states and localities to advance racial equity in the child welfare system and reduce, hopefully, unnecessary child removals, and a 30% increase in funding for state and local child abuse prevention programs. There's also written in that to expand the child tax credit, some money to ensure families have access to affordable childcare, and then $40 billion to support the care economy, including expanding access to Medicaid.
Uh-oh, Kelly, I think you froze again. Last thing we heard was expanding Medicaid. I'll let you know when you're
Another
back.
treatment. I'm so all right. So
No
sorry.
problem. It's the wonders of working from home. But yeah, I think you're back.
Oh, Allison had a good suggestion to turn off my camera. So if it does happen again, I will do that because that may help. Goodness, I was sorry to repeat myself if I am, but just wanted to point out another exciting thing on the horizon is around CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act. Just said I'm unstable. I'm going to turn off my camera so that if I can. Oh, so sorry. Gosh. Okay, hopefully that helps. But the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act is where the CB-CAP funds are pulled from. And so just wanted to let you guys know that that is under up for reauthorization. There's $270 million in there for Title I as well as Title II. And I did not talk about Title II, which is the funding that goes for child welfare agencies to kind of for programming and structural support. So wanted to add that's up for the authorization and has passed out of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and will at some point be up for a full vote. So this is just to show a depiction of how state and local funds cross all levels of prevention and support to families, and this shift in these opportunities and fundings for families to focus on more upstream funding will hopefully support strategies that can stop child abuse and neglect before it occurs. We know that the majority of cases that enter the child welfare system are due to neglect. So if we can better align and utilize funding available to states on setting up parents and families and communities with the skills and resources they need, and put the appropriate funding behind these approaches, we can better support families and remove stressors that could lead to child abuse and neglect. That is all. I'll turn my camera back on. But thank you, Gerard. If there are any questions, I know that was a dense amount of information, so I just wanted to make sure I was able to share it all.
Yeah, that was excellent. And thank you all for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. So before we move on to our Q&A section, we are going to hear from Representative Ashton Clemens of North Carolina. and I will go ahead and give her permission to talk. All right, Representative, the floor is yours.
Hello. Okay, great. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay, good. It's so good to be with everyone. And I'm actually pulled over on the side of Interstate 40 because I'm on the way to Raleigh for a 4 o'clock voting session, but I didn't want to miss this because it's an exciting time for us to really be strategic about how we use the current resources to make long-term gains in many of our states. So I'm in North Carolina. I represent House District 57, and North Carolina got $7.6 million in the CAPTA state grant program. And so our Department of Health and Human Services has been working on how we're going to spend that. And I think the challenge has already been alluded to is that this is money that must be spent, you know, by October 1st, 2023. So we can use it strategically, but what we really need are long-term investments to protect the children of our state. So some of the ways we want to use that strategically are to provide grants for community-based organization to provide follow-up support with families that screen positive for adverse childhood experiences. And a specific way we're going to be supporting that is direct workforce training for ACEs screening across our state with people who are doing these screenings and what support services will look like. And developing and supporting our Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina with Connections Matter, which is our statewide program to support families who do screen higher on some of these screeners with community prevention plans. That's one of our biggest focuses is how do we use these resources to screen more children, get more resources to children and families that have high scores with ACEs, but also how do we develop a workforce that is better equipped in the future to do these ACEs screening and to get resources more quickly to families. The other way we're trying to invest these dollars for long-term success is to strengthen our CPS intake, Child Protective Services intake and initial assessment system. I was an elementary school principal for 8 years, and there was nothing like looking at a child and sitting on the phone for 2 or 3 hours waiting to have the case heard and trying to decide whether to send the child home or not. And we need a strengthened, coordinated, multi-systemic approach so that we can get children help and that they are not having to wait, and the adults who are trying to help them are not having to wait. So we will be spending some of our resources to strengthen that intake and assessment system. And finally, I'll just say, like I started, we do need to use these resources effectively to have some strategies that can carry us forward. But in North Carolina, we in 2017 passed a law, Ryland's Law, because North Carolina failed every single of the federal child welfare indicators. And we have a chronically under-resourced system. And so we can use this, one-time influx of money, and we must continue to advocate for sustained recurring dollars to really support the staff and strategies that we need to protect our children. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Representative. That was wonderful. And now we will open the floor up to your questions. And as we do that, the first question we have here is, I'll pose this question to you, Sarah Catherine, and then Christina, if you have anything to add, and then lastly, we'll let Kelly respond to this question. So the first question is, could you speak to how state, local / local child welfare agencies can better serve American Indian and Native communities? For example, collaborating in tribal / state agreements to leverage funding sources available in tribal communities, or expanding ICWA courts. It's a lot, but I'm happy to repeat sections of that if you need me to.
Okay, no, I can see this in the chat. Thank you.
Great.
I wish that I had a really great answer for you on tribal child welfare agencies and how they could better serve American Indian and Native communities. We have actually been trying to, we're very interested in actually doing a survey of how tribes themselves fund child welfare services. Was because unfortunately our financing survey currently does not include like tribal child welfare systems. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer to that question. I don't know, Christina or Kelly, if either of you have anything that you might want to add about better serving American Indian or Native communities.
I could just jump in quickly and just say kind of ditto from my perspective. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information out there about child welfare financing as it's related to tribal jurisdictions. As Sarah Catherine said, we're trying to start up a project that helps fill that gap, but we're not there yet. But there are arrangements that tribes and states have together to help direct federal funds to tribes. And then there's also opportunities for tribes to connect directly with the federal government to pull funding in. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any resources that really dive into that topic just yet. But Kelly, I'd love to hear if you know of anything.
I think you said it. I wish I had more information too. And I was going to say what you said, Christina, that tribes receive such a different degree of funding from service states and counties. And so I don't have any better answer either, but it is an area that we need to learn more about, and I wish I knew more.
Yeah, and I did drop in the chat just in case it's helpful. There is the part of the Children's Bureau funds capacity building center for tribes. So I popped a link to that quality improvement center in the chat in case that's helpful. Oh, sorry, I just sent that to the panelists, but I'll make sure to send that to everybody. That may be a good resource. But that's definitely a gap that we're trying to fill, try and help fill ourselves.
Great. As a quick follow-up, could any of you speak to what the barriers are for collecting that information?
I can jump in, and Sarah Catherine, you can supplement as needed. But I mean, one thing, a barrier that we're facing on our end is just funding. A lot of people are interested, but there's also a lot of priorities that folks have. So if anyone's aware of someone who would be interested in funding some research into that, please reach out to us. But that's a direct barrier that we have on our end. But in terms of collecting the information itself, we've considered the fact that there are hundreds of tribal communities in the country. So that makes it challenging. Every tribal jurisdiction, just like every state child welfare system, is different. So that poses a challenge. Of course, we could start small with a sample, kind of get a flavor for different ways that some tribes are financing child welfare services and activities. And then, of course, in all research with tribal communities, there is the need to build trust and, get the buy-in of tribal leadership to provide this level of information, which can be, understandably sensitive to provide, given how they're getting money to, and how they're financing their child welfare system. It's understandable that there may be some reluctance to provide that information. So we have folks at Child Trends that specialize and have expertise in working with tribal communities. We have a colleague who is a member of a tribal community. And so, we have ideas for how to overcome that, but that does pose a bit of a challenge that differs from the work that we have done historically with states. Sarah Catherine, is there anything you would add?
No, you went exactly to where I was going with just the need to build that level of trust in research communities with tribes, and making sure that we're taking into consideration cultural aspects of working with tribes as well. And so that it is a challenge that we're always looking to overcome and to take into consideration. So that's just kind of one of the challenges that we have faced in terms of working with tribes. But like Christina said, we're working really hard to try and bring people from tribes into our research, and also looking for funding opportunities for ourselves to be able to do that type of work. So
I would just add, like everyone, capacity and funding are kind of the barriers to that drive. But I would say that in the question, the tribal state agreements, that is a really good place to start, and maybe re-examine any existing agreements that you might have based on the new funding that's coming down to states, and expanding ICWA courts in that same light. Maybe there's some funding can be used to expand those. So that would be my advice.
Great. Kelly, we'll actually start with you for this next one. So someone is curious, how can we protect against the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic? And if you want to specifically talk about how funding plays a role in that.
Yes, the social, the economic, the disruption from the pandemic to lives and is dramatic. So yeah, I guess I would say that really thinking about creatively using the funding out of the American Rescue Plan and the CBCAP funds to really set up strategically a plan to support all families that are going to need support in the long term is a really good idea. And I think the flexibility in the CBCAP guidance is really allowing states to think big, think broad, and collaborate across your state agencies and across partnerships and things like that to really create a system that can support families.
Great. Child Trends, do you guys have anything else to add?
No, I would just echo what Kelly said. The pandemic has been obviously a big shock to the system, but there have also been a lot of additional funds and flexibilities being permitted from the federal government that presents an opportunity to infuse funds into the child welfare system, especially with the focus on prevention. And the pandemic has been a huge stressor on families, and with children being out of school and just the stress on everyone, really, these funds could be used to help mitigate some of the need that really everyone has been facing, but especially families that are at highest risk of getting involved with the child welfare system.
And I've also heard of at least one state that is going to propose, I think in their Family First Prevention Plan, the use of concrete supports as an evidence-based practice. So that would be providing cash assistance or housing assistance or things like that, where we're seeing negative impacts of COVID-19, at least economically, on families, and knowing that there is such a large proportion of children that come into foster care because solely due to neglect. And neglect is often disguised as poverty, or those two things are just they're linked together. And so I've heard a lot more about trying to use concrete supports as prevention. And that's where, some of the things in the rescue plan and the child tax credit and that kind of thing are going to come into play. But there's also been some talk of states trying to put concrete supports into their prevention plan, and we'll see what happens with the Children's Bureau and what they accept as part of those plans. But that's another thing that I've heard other child welfare agencies talking about as well.
Great. Sarah Catherine, since you're still on the screen, I'll go ahead and send this next one your way. To what extent are investments in affordable housing allowed in these new federal investments into prevention? You touched on it a little bit with your
Yeah,
previous.
yeah. I mean, I know in terms of what I wish I knew specifically about housing vouchers. But it looks like Kelly, you may have some stuff to chime in here. I'm not sure if I'm not as familiar with the specifics of the rescue plan as Kelly is. So I'll definitely see if she has anything to add about investments in affordable housing.
I wish I knew more. I just know that there was $5 billion in the American Rescue Plan funds to help communities create affordable housing and services for people at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And I know there's more, so I will do some digging, but there was a significant investment into kind of address housing and address homelessness in the American Rescue Plan.
So we've also received a couple of questions prior to this presentation. So I'll also be peppering those in here a little bit. And so this next question has to do with racial inequality and disproportionality. And how, the question is, how can states use child welfare financing to reduce racial inequalities and disproportionalities in our system? And I'll whichever one of you wants to jump in there first can go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So yeah, this is a question that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And in the Child Welfare Financing Survey report, we have some kind of call out boxes that pull this topic of racial equity into the financing sphere and try to think, okay, how is the way that we're financing child welfare perpetuating the status quo and contributing to disproportionality in the child welfare system? And some of the issues that we raised and that we encourage the readers of the report to consider as they think about child welfare financing is around, one thing is eligibility requirements. So for example, in Title 4E, as we mentioned in our presentation, in the Fostering Connections Act, it allowed states to use Title 4E dollars for extended foster care. So for youth that remain in care past age 18 and up to age 21. But there are eligibility requirements for that. For example, there is some flexibility, but just to simplify, states can require that the youth be involved in an education program or be employed at a certain number of hours a week or per month. And at the surface, you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We want we want youth to be connected to education and work. But there's this broader systemic inequality and racism plays into this as well. That it is harder for children, well, not children at this point, youth 18 to 21, youth of color to meet those eligibility requirements due to the systemic racism that is present in our society. So there's the question, it creates this sort of deserving, undeserving dichotomy of, okay, well, if you're facing more barriers to connect to education, to connect to work, that means you're undeserving of continued foster care support. It's an open question, but that is an example of a way to think about child welfare financing in the lens of racial inequity and kind of perpetuating racial inequity kind of generation to generation. Another example is in TANF. We came across in a great resource from another organization that looked at TANF cash support. So, when we think of TANF, we normally think of cash assistance. But over time, TANF has been used less and less for cash assistance. And like we were mentioning before, these direct supports can be thought of as a child maltreatment prevention intervention. And so with TANF being used less and less for these sorts of direct supports, and being used more and more kind of in a reactionary way. That layered on top of the fact that TANF cash supports have been used less and less, more in states that have higher proportions of African American families. So that has this, again, this tie to racial inequality, that in states that have higher proportions of African American families, they're using TANF less for cash supports, which then could draw, that means these families have less of this prevention opportunity as families in other states. So those are just, there are other examples, but those are just two ways to kind of think about child welfare financing in the context of this important emphasis and important attention to racial equity.
Great, that was a full answer. So one of the other questions we have is, do you believe current trending spending trends reflect state priorities and values? And I'll once again leave this one up to the first brave person to hop in.
All right, well, I will take this one. This kind of ties into the kind of our bigger point that, like, no, if you've seen one child welfare system, you've seen one child welfare system. So it's, it's kind of hard to say state by state what priority, if priorities are matching up with spending. However, there has been a general shift towards, and climate and culture and child welfare of paying more attention to prevention and, slowly trying to move things upstream. And, the Family First Prevention Services Act is, has been, is a step in that direction. However, there are, lots of folks who would argue it didn't go far enough. That, we're reaching, we talk a lot about, oh, we got people, as they came in the front door, on the front porch, but what can we do to keep them from coming in the front yard of, and thinking of child welfare, or in, the example that Kelly had of, the stream, right, of catching kids, further up the stream. So, I mean, in that sense, I do think that, there has been a shift towards, towards prevention, which, there's just child welfare practitioners in general, I think are thinking, well, what investments can we make to keep kids from coming into care? Like it is an investment up front, in hopes that, fewer children will come into care. So, I do think in that sense, it is reflecting priorities, but we encourage all of you on this call to, think about what's going on in your state and in your community, in your locality, and talk with the child welfare agencies in your area to find out what their priorities are, and then take a look at what you're funding. And, if you're in a position to influence how that purse is being spent, which I think a lot of you are, we highly encourage you to do that. But do it in conjunction with the stakeholders, right? Child welfare agencies, Department of Aging. We have so many grandparents that are, stepping up and, caring for their grandchildren. We have Department of Housing, with who knows what's going to happen with evictions coming up soon, so it is a system. It's not just the child welfare agency isn't the only player. So we also encourage folks to kind of reach throughout your community to find all of these agencies that are touching these children and families, to see kind of like holistically what can be done to support them. So I'll stop there.
Great. Kelly, did you want to hop in there?
I just wanted to say thank you for jumping in, Sarah Catherine, because that was a really good answer. I mean, protecting children and families in whatever way is reflective of a state, priorities. And so it's just important to think, your advice on really thinking about what the priorities are and matching that with the funding is a really smart way to really think about where are the investments, are they in the right spot? But that was a great answer, Sarah.
So I think we have time for just one more question, and this is to all three of you once again. If a legislator left this call today, what's the one thing you hope they leave with? What's the one major takeaway you hope you've imparted upon them? And I'll let you go ahead and start, Kelly.
All right. Oh boy. I would just say that there is a lot of decisions that states can make, a lot of power and kind of the decisions that states make. And I think I'm going to go with Sarah Catherine's that reflect, aligning priorities with all these funding opportunities is a really a big lesson. And I think that states, there's a lot of opportunities to leverage funds right now, and being strategic about how you think about how those funds get spent to better serve kids and families is, I hope the takeaway that, yeah, you really dig into the needs in your communities.
Great. Well, I will jump in and add to what I said before and to what Kelly echoed, that I also think it's, there's an opportunity to kind of think outside the box here. And I, kind of piggybacking off of the things that Christina was talking about is, really, I encourage folks to really think, more deeply about the impacts of systemic racism and how that could, unintentionally influence, outcomes for children and families, and, really think about, any policies that are put forth or funding decisions that are put forth. I encourage everyone to really take a moment and consider the impacts of historical and systemic racism on those, and kind of, just think down the road a little bit of, about the decisions you're making and how they may or may not affect folks equitably. So.
And ditto what Sarah Catherine and Kelly said, and I would just add that, in terms of coming away from today's conversation, I would encourage you to think about, why does my state, for example, fund child welfare the way we do? Is it a strategic decision that we've made, based off our priorities, based off a full consideration of all the funding streams that are available to us? Or is there an opportunity, for example, to use different funding streams that we're not using so much? Or is there an opportunity to use the funding streams we are using in a different way, so that we can better use the money to more fully support children and families? As you saw throughout our conversation today, this is a pretty complex financing system, and it can be easy to kind of get into silos and look at this funding stream and then look at that funding stream, and this goes to that agency and this goes to that agency. But rather, it's the children and families don't care if it's 4E, 4B, CAFTA, maybe, it's all of this money is going to support their, better outcomes. So I encourage folks to kind of try to take that step back, see the big picture, and see, are we achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve, and are we using this funding in the most strategic way possible?
Great. Thank you all so much again. And thank you all for attending this meeting today, this webinar today. I hope you all have learned just a little bit about child welfare financing. On your screen are a few ways to stay connected with NCSL. There will be a recording made available of this webinar, as well as the slides will be made available on the landing page for the webinar. And with that, once again, my name is Gerard Brown, and please feel free to reach out to me with your child welfare related questions. Be on the lookout for a recording of today's meeting, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.